The wooden marvel they had mocked became their most elusive nightmare. In the skies over Berlin in 1943, the feared Luftwaffe, architects of terror across Europe, found themselves humiliated by what they had initially dismissed as a primitive anomaly. The de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito, constructed primarily of wood in an era of all-metal combat aircraft, flew faster, higher, and with greater impunity through the Third Reich's capital than any Allied aircraft before it. The Wooden Wonder, as it became affectionately known to its crews, transformed from an object of German ridicule into the phantom that haunted Hitler's most protected airspace, striking with precision and vanishing before the defenders could react. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The concept seemed almost laughable at first glance. Build a high-performance military aircraft out of wood during the age of aluminum and steel warplanes. Even within British aviation circles, skepticism ran deep. The Air Ministry had initially rejected Geoffrey de Havilland's unconventional proposal in 1938, considering it too radical a departure from established doctrine. Traditional military thinking held that combat aircraft required the durability of metal to survive the rigors of war, but de Havilland, already an established aircraft designer, persisted with an almost prophetic vision. The geopolitical climate of late 1930s Europe had created a perfect storm of circumstances that would ultimately vindicate his unorthodox approach. As Hitler's Germany rapidly expanded its military capabilities, Britain faced not only the threat of war, but also critical shortages of strategic materials, particularly aluminum. The Luftwaffe had prioritized metal aircraft construction, consuming enormous quantities of aluminum and other metals for their expanding air fleet. De Havilland recognized an opportunity hidden within this challenge. What if an aircraft could be built primarily from materials not considered strategic resources? Wood, particularly birch and balsa, remained abundant. More crucially, Britain possessed a deep reserve of skilled woodworkers in its furniture industry, craftsmen whose talents could be redirected to aircraft production without extensive retraining. This would circumvent the bottlenecks in aluminum supply chains while freeing metal resources for other critical war applications. What began as a material workaround soon revealed unexpected advantages that would prove decisive in the skies over Berlin. The Mosquito's wooden construction yielded a remarkably light airframe compared to metal equivalents. Its smooth molded surfaces created less drag than riveted metal, and the composite wooden structure absorbed radar waves better than aluminum, making it more difficult to detect, a primitive form of stealth decades before such technology became formalized. What started as an expedient became a revolution in aircraft design. By 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged and the Blitz began, the first Mosquito prototypes were taking shape at de Havilland's facility in Hatfield. The maiden flight on November 25, 1940, demonstrated performance capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The prototype reached speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, faster than the frontline Spitfire fighters of the day. The aircraft's exceptional speed derived from its aerodynamically clean design, lightweight construction, and powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants that drove the legendary Spitfire. What de Havilland had created was something unprecedented, an aircraft so fast it could potentially operate without defensive armament, relying on speed alone for survival. The Luftwaffe's intelligence services received reports of this new British aircraft with a mixture of amusement and dismissal. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, reportedly scoffed at the notion of a wooden combat aircraft, considering it a desperate measure by a nation running out of proper materials. German propaganda portrayed the Mosquito as evidence of Britain's industrial inferiority, forced to build planes from furniture while Germany's factories produced advanced all-metal designs. This narrative of technological superiority formed a crucial component of Nazi messaging, both to the German public and to occupied territories. The Mosquito would soon turn this narrative on its head. As the first production Mosquitoes entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1941, they were initially deployed as unarmed high-speed photo reconnaissance platforms. These early reconnaissance missions provided vital intelligence while demonstrating the aircraft's exceptional survivability. Flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet and speeds exceeding 400 mph, Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft regularly returned with photographs of German installations, troop movements, and potential bombing targets, all while evading interception attempts. The true potential of the Mosquito as an offensive weapon remained largely untapped until Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, recognized what he had at his disposal. While the massive four-engine heavy bombers like the Lancaster and Halifax formed the backbone of the night bombing campaign against Germany, they suffered horrific losses when attempting daylight raids. The Mosquito offered something different: the speed and agility to penetrate German airspace in daylight with relative impunity. The strategic situation facing Allied bombing forces in 1942-43 had reached a critical juncture. The night bombing campaign, while causing disruption to German industry and civilian morale, lacked the precision needed to deliver knockout blows to specific targets. Daylight bombing missions by the American 8th Air Force's B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers sustained catastrophic losses to Luftwaffe fighters, with some missions losing over 60 aircraft, 600 men killed, wounded, or captured in a single day's operation. The Mosquito offered a third option that would exploit gaps in German air defenses. The aircraft's versatility had already been demonstrated through various modifications. The basic airframe had been adapted into a fighter variant armed with 4 20mm cannons and 4.303 machine guns in the nose, a devastating concentration of firepower. Another variant carried a 4,000-pound cookie bomb, a massive explosive ordinarily requiring a 4-engine heavy bomber to deliver. The fighter-bomber variant could carry both substantial armament and a significant bomb load. But perhaps most revolutionary was the precision bombing variant, equipped with advanced navigation equipment and operated by a crew of just 2, a pilot and navigator, bomb aimer. By late 1942, the Mosquito's exceptional capabilities were becoming clear to Allied planners. Yet the Luftwaffe continued to underestimate the wooden aircraft, a miscalculation that would cost them dearly. German air defense doctrine had been developed to counter conventional bomber formations, either slow, heavily armed boxes of American daylight bombers flying in tight defensive formations, or RAF heavy bombers operating under cover of darkness. Their fighter tactics, radar systems, and anti-aircraft batteries were optimized for these threats. The Mosquito, operating alone or in small formations at high speed and often at low altitude, represented a fundamentally different challenge. The first Mosquito raid on Berlin occurred on January 30, 1943, a date deliberately chosen for its symbolic significance as the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. That day, the Nazi elite had gathered for commemorative ceremonies in the German capital. Berlin represented the heart of the Third Reich, not just administratively, but psychologically. Its air defenses were among the most formidable in Europe, with multiple rings of anti-aircraft batteries, radar-directed searchlights, and fighter airfields positioned to protect the capital from Allied bombing. The mission was assigned to 3 Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron, led by squadron leader George Perry. The aircraft were specially modified PR, photo reconnaissance variants, adapted to carry 4 500-pound bombs each. The mission profile called for them to approach Berlin at high altitude, then descend rapidly to rooftop level for the bomb run, a tactic designed to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire and evade radar detection. The 3 Mosquitoes departed RAF Marham in Norfolk at precisely 11 Fahrenheit hours. The timing was calculated to allow them to reach Berlin during the planned ceremonies, maximizing the psychological impact. The crews understood the significance of their mission, not just militarily but symbolically. They would demonstrate that no location in the Third Reich was beyond Allied reach, and they would do so with an aircraft the Germans had ridiculed. The flight to Berlin took them across the North Sea, over occupied Denmark, and into German airspace. Flying individually rather than in formation to reduce visibility, the Mosquitoes maintained an altitude of 25,000 feet for most of the journey. German radar operators detected unidentified aircraft, but struggled to maintain tracking due to the Mosquito's speed and the natural radar-absorbing properties of their wooden construction. Several Luftwaffe fighter units were scrambled in response, but without precise intercept vectors, the fighters patrolled blindly, burning precious fuel while the Mosquitoes continued toward their target. As they approached the outskirts of Berlin, the Mosquito crews initiated their attack profile, descending rapidly to an altitude of just 200 feet. At this height, they flew below the effective engagement envelope of most anti-aircraft batteries, while their speed, over 380 km/h at this altitude, made them nearly impossible to track with optical sights. Berlin streets and landmarks flashed beneath them as they navigated toward the government district where Nazi officials had gathered. Squadron leader Perry's aircraft reached the target first, releasing its bombs directly over the Wilhelmstrasse, where Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels was in the middle of a radio broadcast celebrating the anniversary. The detonations were clearly audible over the airwaves, abruptly interrupting the transmission. The other two Mosquitoes delivered their payloads minutes later, targeting nearby government buildings. The precision of the attack astounded even the crews themselves. They had not only reached Berlin in broad daylight, but had struck within meters of their intended targets. The psychological impact far exceeded the physical damage. Nazi propaganda had consistently assured Germans that the Reich's air defenses made Berlin impregnable to daylight raids. Now, on a day of national celebration, with the city's air defenses at maximum alert, 3 wooden aircraft had penetrated to the very heart of the capital, dropped their bombs, and escaped unscathed. More humiliating still, radio listeners across Germany and occupied Europe had heard the raid unfold in real time, undermining confidence in Luftwaffe protection. The response from German Air Defense Command was immediate and furious. Hermann Göring, whose boast that no enemy aircraft will fly over Reich territory had been dramatically disproven, demanded answers. Luftwaffe fighter units received standing orders to prioritize interception of Mosquitoes, even at the expense of larger bomber formations. Additional radar stations were hastily established around Berlin, and anti-aircraft units were ordered to develop new targeting techniques for high-speed, low-altitude intruders. Yet the fundamental problem remained. The Mosquito's performance envelope exceeded that of most Luftwaffe interceptors. The standard Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters could match the Mosquito's speed only in short bursts and lacked the sustained high-speed performance to chase down the British aircraft over long distances. Only the Bf-109G6AS, with its high-altitude optimized DB605AS engine and the specialized Fw-190D, had any realistic chance of interception, and these were available in limited numbers, primarily assigned to defense of the Reich against American bomber formations. Following the success of the January 30th raid, RAF planners quickly recognized the potential of the Mosquito for what they termed surgical strikes, precision attacks against specific high-value targets rather than area bombing. The psychological warfare aspect was equally valuable. The ability to strike the German capital with relative impunity undercut Nazi propaganda claims of invulnerability and demonstrated Allied technological prowess. On February 25, 1943, Mosquitoes struck Berlin again, this time targeting the main broadcasting station during a speech by Hermann Göring himself. 8 aircraft from 139 Squadron participated, timing their attack to coincide precisely with Göring's address. As with the previous raid, the bombs could be heard exploding in the background of the broadcast. German newspapers were forbidden from reporting the incident, but word spread rapidly through the population, further undermining confidence in Luftwaffe protection. The Mosquitoes returned to Berlin on March 8th, targeting the Krupp munitions works. This time, the Luftwaffe was better prepared, with fighter units on high alert and anti-aircraft batteries primed for low-level intruders. Nevertheless, of the 12 Mosquitoes dispatched, 11 reached the target and released their bombs accurately. One aircraft was damaged by flak, but managed to return to Britain. The precision of these attacks stood in stark contrast to the area bombing conducted by heavy bomber formations, which often missed their targets by miles. By spring 1943, the Mosquito phenomenon had become a serious concern for German military leadership. Intelligence reports now referred to the aircraft with grudging respect rather than derision. Luftwaffe pilots reported that the wooden bomber would often appear without warning, strike, and vanish before they could achieve an intercept position. Some German fighter units began referring to the Mosquito as Der Hölzerne Wunder, the Wooden Wonder, unknowingly echoing the nickname given by its British crews. The technical challenge of intercepting Mosquitoes led to specialized Luftwaffe units equipped with the latest aircraft variants and modified specifically for high-speed interception. The Jagdgeschwader 300, originally formed as a night fighter unit, received a number of Bf 109G6AS fighters optimized for high-altitude performance. These aircraft had their armor and some weapons removed to improve speed and climb rate. Ironic modifications given that the Mosquito's lack of defensive armament had initially been considered a weakness by German analysts. Despite these countermeasures, Mosquito losses on Berlin raids remained remarkably low compared to other bombing operations. While the massive raids by Lancaster and Halifax bombers often suffered loss rates of 5 to 10% per mission, Mosquito operations typically lost fewer than 1% of aircraft dispatched. This allowed crews to gain experience and confidence, further improving their effectiveness. Many Mosquito crews completed 30 or more operational sorties, an almost unheard-of number when heavy bomber crews were considered lucky to survive a tour of 20 operations. The summer of 1943 saw the Mosquito campaign against Berlin intensify, with near-daily raids against various targets throughout the city. Rather than focusing exclusively on military or industrial targets, planners deliberately varied the targets and timing to maximize disruption and psychological impact. Government offices would be struck during working hours, forcing evacuations and disrupting administration. Transportation hubs would be hit during rush hours. On several occasions, Mosquitoes would drop bombs on the exclusive western suburbs where many Nazi officials lived, directly impacting the ruling elite. One of the most psychologically effective tactics developed was the nuisance raid, small formations of Mosquitoes that would appear over Berlin at random times, triggering air raid alerts and forcing civilians into shelters, often for hours at a time. These raids caused minimal physical damage but maximum disruption to daily life and industrial productivity. After weeks of such operations, many Berliners developed what German medical authorities termed mosquito anxiety, a constant state of nervousness and expectation of raids that contributed to sleep deprivation, reduced work efficiency, and declining morale. The Luftwaffe's frustration grew as interception rates remained dismally low. In one particularly humiliating incident in July 1943, a formation of 4 Mosquitoes flew directly over Luftwaffe headquarters at Potsdam, dropping a single 4,000-pound cookie bomb that destroyed several administrative buildings. Reconnaissance photographs taken by the same aircraft minutes later showed the devastation clearly, copies of which were later dropped over Berlin as propaganda leaflets with the message, "The wooden aircraft you laughed at did this." As summer turned to autumn, the Mosquito force operating against Berlin continued to evolve tactically. Rather than always relying on sheer speed and surprise, Some operations now deliberately baited Luftwaffe interceptors into fuel-consuming chases. A Mosquito would allow itself to be detected approaching Berlin, then lead pursuing fighters on an extended high-speed chase, burning their limited fuel supplies before accelerating away. Meanwhile, other Mosquitoes would approach from different vectors to strike the target. German fighter pilots began to report suspicions that they were being deliberately manipulated, but their standing orders required them to attempt interception of all detected Mosquitoes. The relationship between Mosquito crews and the aircraft they flew developed into something approaching reverence. Unlike the cramped, cold conditions of heavy bombers, the Mosquito's two-man crew compartment was relatively comfortable. The aircraft's handling characteristics were described as fighter-like by pilots transitioning from larger bombers. Most significantly, the Mosquito offered something precious few other bomber crews experienced: a genuine expectation of survival. The special bond between man and machine was reflected in the personalized artwork and names that adorned many Mosquitoes, often incorporating wordplay around their wooden construction or speed: Splinter, Termite Terror, Balsa Bill, and Lightning Lumber among them. By late 1943, the Mosquito raids over Berlin had achieved a psychological impact disproportionate to the tonnage of bombs dropped. German air defense resources were being stretched thin, with increasing numbers of fighters and anti-aircraft batteries diverted to Berlin's protection at the expense of other targets. Yet still the wooden wonder came, slipping through the defensive screen to deliver its payloads with remarkable precision. The raids had demonstrated something profound: that technological sophistication did not always require the most advanced materials or the most complex solutions. Sometimes, as Geoffrey de Havilland had intuited years earlier, the answer lay in rethinking fundamental assumptions. As winter approached, the Mosquito campaign prepared to enter a new phase. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were developing specialized interception tactics and technologies specifically to counter the Mosquito threat, a testament to how seriously they now took the aircraft they had once mocked. Hitler himself reportedly demanded updates on counter-Mosquito measures, considering the raids a personal affront. The wooden aircraft, built from what the Germans had dismissed as furniture material, had penetrated the heart of the Third Reich repeatedly, striking with impunity and exposing the hollow promises of Luftwaffe protection. But the story of the Mosquito over Berlin was far from over. The most daring missions, the most precise strikes, and the most extraordinary acts of aerial defiance were yet to come. The winter of 1943-44 brought new challenges for Mosquito operations over Berlin. The harsh weather conditions that traditionally hampered bombing operations affected the wooden wonder less severely than their larger counterparts. While heavy bombers often remained grounded by ice, snow, and poor visibility, the Mosquito's speed and ceiling allowed it to operate above much of the worst weather. This meteorological advantage became particularly significant in December 1943, when fog and low cloud covered much of northern Europe for weeks, severely restricting conventional bombing operations. On December 13, 1943, while RAF Bomber Command's heavy bombers remained grounded, 6 Mosquitoes from 105 and 139 squadrons took off for Berlin in conditions other aircraft couldn't operate in. Using their oboe navigation system, a precision radio guidance technology, they successfully delivered their payloads on the Siemens factories in the northwest of the city. The raid occurred during what Berliners had come to consider a weather exemption from bombing. The psychological impact of bombs falling during conditions locals believed provided safety further deepened anxiety among the population. A German meteorologist at the Berlin weather station later recalled in his post-war memoirs, "When the sirens remained silent for days due to the fog, people breathed easier. Then came the sound, that distinctive whine of the Mosquito engines, followed by explosions. After that, no weather gave Berliners comfort." The Siemens raid demonstrated another crucial advantage of the Mosquito. its ability to operate with minimal crew risk compared to heavy bombers. While a Lancaster raid might risk 70 airmen to deliver a similar bomb load, the 6 Mosquitoes risked only 12 men. This risk-to-payload ratio became increasingly important as the war progressed, and experienced aircrew became an ever more precious resource. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris noted in a December 1943 memo to the Air Ministry, "The Mosquito has proven itself capable of delivering precision attacks at 1/5 the human cost of conventional bomber operations. This represents an economy of force that we cannot afford to ignore." The German response intensified as specialized night fighter units were increasingly tasked with Mosquito interception. The Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, NJG-1, equipped with radar-equipped Bf-110 heavy fighters, deployed specifically to intercept Mosquitoes using a technique they called Zachmesau, tame boar. Rather than relying on ground control intercept, these pilots operated semi-autonomously, patrolling likely Mosquito approach corridors at varying altitudes. This approach yielded some success. In late December, 2 Mosquitoes were shot down during a raid on the Deutsche Opernhaus, where Nazi officials were attending a Christmas gala. The Deutsche Opernhaus raid on December 24, 1943, represented a particularly audacious application of psychological warfare. Intelligence reports had indicated that a significant gathering of Luftwaffe leadership would be attending a performance of Wagner's Die Walküre, an event deliberately scheduled for Christmas Eve to boost morale. 4 Mosquitoes targeted the building with delayed-action bombs, timed to detonate approximately 30 minutes into the performance. While the physical damage was relatively minor, the psychological impact was profound. Goering, in attendance that night, was reportedly ushered from the building by his security detail, his uniform contrasting with civilians fleeing in evening wear. A Swedish diplomatic attaché present that evening later wrote, "The great irony was watching the mighty Luftwaffe commanders, men who had orchestrated the bombing of Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London, now running from a handful of wooden planes they couldn't stop." The losses, while statistically minimal, sent ripples of concern through RAF Mosquito units. The German defenders were adapting, learning, and developing countermeasures specifically for the Wooden Wonder. The era of near-complete impunity was ending, requiring tactical evolution from the Mosquito force. The response came in the form of new electronic countermeasures and more unpredictable routing. Mosquitoes began carrying mandrel jamming devices that could disrupt German Freya and Würzburg radar systems, creating electronic corridors through which the aircraft could approach undetected. Wing Commander John Wooldridge, commander of 105 Squadron, pioneered what became known as the Wooldridge Weave, a technique where Mosquitoes would make random, unpredictable course changes during their approach to Berlin. The weaving flight path made tracking by ground radar significantly more difficult and complicated interception attempts by Luftwaffe fighters. In his post-operation report from January 1944, Wooldridge noted, "By introducing an element of randomness into our flight paths, we forced German controllers to constantly recalculate intercept vectors for their fighters. The resulting confusion buys us precious minutes, often all we need to deliver our payloads and begin our escape." January 1944 saw the introduction of spoof raids, Mosquitoes deliberately triggering Berlin's air defense system but carrying no bombs, instead focusing on dropping window, metallized paper strips that created false radar returns to confuse German radar operators. These missions would often coincide with actual bombing raids elsewhere in Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to divide its increasingly stretched resources. The psychological toll on Berliners, mounted as air raid sirens, wailed almost nightly, whether actual bombs fell or not. A particularly effective spoof operation occurred on January 15, 1944, when 8 Mosquitoes conducted a simulated attack on Berlin, while a major RAF bomber stream targeted Frankfurt. The Berlin defense system was fully activated, searchlights sweeping the sky, anti-aircraft batteries firing, and fighters scrambled. Meanwhile, the Mosquitoes simply dropped window and departed, having drawn significant defensive resources away from the actual target. A Luftwaffe fighter control officer, later captured and interrogated by Allied forces, described the frustration. "We would vector our fighters toward radar contacts, only to find nothing but these metal strips floating in the air. By the time we realized we were chasing ghosts, the real attack would be underway elsewhere, and our fighters would be low on fuel." The tactical cat-and-mouse game reached new levels of sophistication with the introduction of Mosquito Mk-16th aircraft equipped with the H-2S ground mapping radar. These aircraft could identify targets through cloud cover or darkness with unprecedented precision. Combined with the 4,000-pound Cookie bomb, a single Mosquito could now deliver the destructive power previously requiring multiple heavy bombers, with far greater accuracy and drastically lower crew risk. Flight Lieutenant Derek Lovell of 692 Squadron described the experience of H-2S guided precision bombing in his combat report from February 1944. "The sensation is extraordinary, flying through solid cloud at 28,000 feet, seeing nothing visually, yet watching Berlin's layout appear on the radar screen as clearly as a map. We identified the railway marshalling yards from their distinctive pattern and delivered our 4,000-pounder with confidence that we were hitting the target, not civilian areas half a mile away. This is a new kind of warfare, unseen attackers striking precisely through clouds that would have grounded any operation a year ago." A particularly audacious demonstration of the Mosquito's capabilities occurred on January 30, 1944, exactly 1 year after the first Mosquito raid on Berlin and the 11th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. A formation of 12 Mosquitoes from 105, 139, and 627 squadrons penetrated Berlin's defenses during a major Nazi party gathering at the Sportpalast. The timing was precisely calculated to disrupt Hermann Göring's speech, a deliberate echo of the raid a year earlier. The psychological warfare aspect of the operation was reinforced by the BBC, which broadcast news of the successful raid within hours, contrasting the disruption with German propaganda claims of improved air defenses. The raid was meticulously planned to maximize both physical and psychological impact. 6 aircraft carried conventional high-explosive bombs, while the remaining 6 carried a new weapon, 4-pound incendiary bombs, designed specifically to penetrate the Sportpalast's roof. The timing was orchestrated with precision. The first bombs fell at 11:45 a.m., exactly as Göring was beginning to speak. The sound of detonations and subsequent fire alarms was clearly audible to radio listeners across Europe. BBC monitoring services recorded the broadcast, capturing the moment when Göring's speech was interrupted by distant explosions, followed by audible confusion and the abrupt termination of the transmission. The reaction from Nazi leadership was furious. Göring, whose promises of protection had been repeatedly exposed as hollow, faced increasing criticism within Nazi inner circles. Hitler reportedly raged about the British wooden birds that continued to humiliate the Luftwaffe. The propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels struggled to maintain the narrative of German technological superiority in the face of these repeated demonstrations of Allied innovation. In a remarkable shift from earlier dismissals, German aviation journals now published technical analyses of the Mosquito, acknowledging its revolutionary design principles. A classified Luftwaffe technical assessment from February 1944, later captured by advancing Allied forces, revealed the extent of this shift in perspective. The de Havilland Mosquito represents an approach to aircraft design fundamentally different from our own. Its wooden construction, initially dismissed as primitive, provides significant advantages in terms of radar reflection, weight-to-strength ratio, and resource efficiency. The aircraft's performance envelope exceeds that of our standard interceptors, particularly in terms of speed at medium to high altitudes. Recommendations for countering this threat must focus on specialized interceptors and improved early warning systems rather than conventional fighter tactics. For the crews flying these missions, the experience was uniquely intense. Unlike the massive bomber streams of Lancaster and Halifax aircraft, Mosquito operations were often conducted by solo aircraft or small formations, creating a profound sense of isolation over enemy territory. Flight Lieutenant Alan Wagner of 105 Squadron later recalled, "In a heavy bomber, you were part of a 100-aircraft stream. In a Mosquito, especially on daylight precision raids, you were often alone, just you and your navigator, hundreds of miles into enemy territory, with the entire Luftwaffe seemingly focused on finding you. The difference was, we could outrun them." The two-man crew dynamic created intense bonds between pilots and navigators. Navigator Flight Sergeant Thomas Reynolds wrote in his diary in March 1944, "There's an intimacy to Mosquito operations unlike anything in larger aircraft. Your life depends entirely on one other person, and his on you. You develop an almost telepathic understanding." After our third Berlin raid, Johnny, his pilot, and I found we had started finishing each other's sentences. The ground crews joke that we've become the same person in two bodies. Perhaps they're right. This sense of vulnerability, combined with confidence in their aircraft, created an unusual psychological profile among Mosquito crews. They developed an almost superstitious relationship with their wooden aircraft, often referring to them with female pronouns and personalizing them to degrees uncommon, even in a service known for such practices. Many crews refused to fly any Mosquito other than their aircraft, believing certain airframes had lucky characteristics. Maintenance crews observed that pilots would often physically pat the wooden fuselage before missions, a gesture somewhere between affection and talisman touching. Group Captain John Cunningham, the RAF's highest-scoring night fighter ace, who flew Mosquitoes extensively, explained this relationship in a 1944 interview with the Aeroplane magazine. "You develop a relationship with the Mosquito unlike any other aircraft I've flown. Perhaps it's the wood, something organic and alive compared to the cold metal of other aircraft. You feel the airframe flexing and responding. On moonlit nights, you can sometimes see the wings gently bending as you maneuver. It gives the impression of a living thing rather than a machine." I know pilots who speak to their Mosquitoes, and I've caught myself doing it as well. February 1944 brought a significant escalation in the Mosquito campaign against Berlin with the formation of the Light Night Striking Force, LNSF, composed entirely of Mosquito bombers. Operating from bases in eastern England, this specialized force would conduct near-nightly raids on Berlin and other German cities for the remainder of the war. Unlike the broader strategic bombing campaign, which focused on area destruction, the LNSF specialized in precision strikes against specific targets and nuisance raids designed to maximize disruption and psychological impact. The LNSF represented a fundamental shift in bombing philosophy, the application of minimal force with maximum precision, rather than overwhelming force with limited accuracy. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, commander of the Pathfinder Force, articulated this philosophy in a March 1944 briefing. "The Mosquito enables us to place a bomb through a specific window rather than merely in the vicinity of a building. This precision, combined with persistent pressure through nightly operations, creates effects disproportionate to the tonnage delivered. We achieve disruption not through destruction of entire districts, but through the precision elimination of critical nodes and the constant pressure that prevents recovery and adaptation." The LNSF operated according to principles that would later become standard in modern air warfare: precision, minimal force, and maximum psychological effect. Rather than dropping hundreds of tons of bombs indiscriminately, they would deliver smaller payloads with pinpoint accuracy against carefully selected targets. Government buildings would be struck during working hours, factories during shift changes, and transportation hubs during peak usage. The unpredictability of these attacks generated anxiety and disruption far beyond the physical damage inflicted. One of the most audacious Mosquito operations against Berlin occurred on March 30, 1944, when 6 aircraft from 600 Mate Squadron targeted the Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse. The timing was specifically chosen to coincide with the morning staff meeting, where high-ranking Gestapo officials would be gathered. Led by Wing Commander Bob Bateson, the Mosquitoes approached Berlin at rooftop level, navigating by visual landmarks through the city center. 4 of the 6 aircraft scored direct hits on the target building, collapsing several sections of the structure during the meeting. While German authorities never released casualty figures, intelligence reports suggested that several senior Gestapo officials were among the dead and wounded. The precision of this attack demonstrated a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. The ability to strike specific rooms within specific buildings at specific times, rather than simply bombing general areas. This capability, revolutionary in 1944, would become the standard for modern air operations decades later. The Mosquito had effectively pioneered the concept of the surgical strike, long before guided munitions made such operations commonplace. The Prinz Albrechtstrasse operation had been meticulously planned using intelligence from the French resistance, which had identified not only the meeting time, but the specific room where Gestapo leadership would gather. The raid was timed to coincide with the arrival of Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, who typically arrived at 10:15 a.m. for the daily operational meeting. Squadron leader Jack Nicholson, who piloted one of the Mosquitoes, described the approach in his after-action report. "We came in from the east at rooftop level, using the Spree River as our primary reference. The visibility was excellent, almost too good, as it made us more vulnerable to flak. We identified the target building precisely from its distinctive architecture and courtyard. My bomb aimer called 'steady' as we approached, then 'bombs gone' at exactly 10:17. As we banked away, I observed at least 2 direct hits on the eastern wing, where intelligence had placed the conference room. The psychological impact of these precision raids extended beyond the general population to affect the Nazi leadership directly. Hitler's appearances in Berlin became increasingly rare, as Mosquito raids demonstrated that no location in the capital was truly secure. By April 1944, he had largely relocated to the Berghof in Bavaria and the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, distant from the Reich capital he had once proudly proclaimed would become Germania, the eternal capital of the 1,000-year Reich. The wooden aircraft he had once mocked had literally driven him from his seat of power. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later Minister of Armaments, noted in his post-war memoirs the profound psychological impact the Mosquito raids had on the Nazi leadership. The precision of these attacks created a sense of personal vulnerability among the Reich leadership that the massive area bombing raids never achieved. One could shelter from waves of heavy bombers in the massive flak towers or deep bunkers, but the Mosquitoes struck so suddenly, so precisely, that no warning was possible. After several government buildings were hit during working hours, many ministers began conducting business from suburban locations or bunkers. Hitler himself became increasingly reluctant to visit Berlin, fearing that precise intelligence was guiding these pinpoint attacks. The response from the Luftwaffe took increasingly desperate forms. A specialized interception unit, Jagdgeschwader 50, was formed in early 1944, specifically to counter Mosquito intrusions over Berlin. Equipped with the latest Bf-109G and Fw-90D fighters stripped of excess weight and armor, these aircraft could theoretically match the Mosquito's performance envelope. Their pilots, many drawn from experienced Eastern Front veterans, were offered substantial bonuses and decorations for successful Mosquito kills. Major Hermann Graf, a highly decorated Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories on the Eastern Front, was appointed to lead JG-50's anti-Mosquito operations. In his first operational directive to his pilots, he emphasized the unique challenges of the mission. Forget everything you have learned about fighter tactics. The Mosquito is not a conventional bomber that can be attacked from standard approach vectors. It is faster than you, can climb as well as you, and will exploit any tactical error. Your advantages are minimal, slightly better acceleration and roll rate. You must use these advantages perfectly, or you will never close to firing range. This is the most challenging intercept mission in the Luftwaffe today. Despite these measures, success remained elusive. Luftwaffe. Pilot Hans Eckehard Bob, an ace with over 60 victories on the Eastern Front, described the frustration. Chasing mosquitoes was like trying to catch a shadow. You would get radar vectors, pour on full power, strain to reach their altitude, and then nothing. They were gone. Sometimes we would see them for a brief moment, but they were always just beyond reach. It was maddening. In a particularly revealing incident in April 1944, a Bf 109G-6AS, piloted by Oberleutnant Werner Schröer, an experienced ace with over 100 victories, managed to close within firing range of a Mosquito returning from Berlin. Schröer fired a burst from his 20mm cannons, scoring several hits on the Mosquito's port wing. Yet the wooden bomber continued flying, its structural integrity maintained despite damage that would have crippled a metal aircraft. The Mosquito escaped into cloud cover and returned safely to England. Upon inspection, engineers found that the wooden wing structure had absorbed the cannon shells with less structural damage than would have occurred in a metal airframe, where the shells would have created more extensive hydrostatic shock through the rigid material. The technical challenges of interception were compounded by the psychological impact on German fighter pilots. Many had been raised in a military culture that emphasized aggressive pursuit of the enemy, yet the Mosquito forced them into a reactive posture where success was defined by defense rather than attack. The symbolic significance, German fighters unable to protect German soil from British intruders, created a demoralizing dynamic within Luftwaffe fighter units. Luftwaffe psychologists noted increasing frustration among fighter pilots assigned to anti-Mosquito duties. A report from the Luftwaffe Medical Service dated May 1944 observed, pilots transferred from frontline fighter units to home defense interception duties show signs of psychological stress disproportionate to the physical dangers involved. The inability to successfully engage the enemy despite flying superior German aircraft creates profound frustration. Several pilots have requested transfer back to the Eastern Front, where they feel their skills can be more effectively employed. This represents a concerning inversion of the normal preference for safer home defense duties. By mid-1944, the Mosquito campaign against Berlin had evolved into a sophisticated operation integrating various elements of air power. Serrate Mosquitoes, specialized night fighters equipped to home in on Luftwaffe radar emissions, would accompany bombing Mosquitoes, hunting German night fighters that rose to intercept the raiders. This hunter-hunted dynamic created additional psychological pressure on German defenders who now faced the prospect of becoming targets themselves when attempting to intercept the wooden bombers. Squadron leader Rory Donaldson, commanding a Mosquito night fighter unit equipped with Serrate, described the tactics in a June 1944 operational summary. We patrol the likely intercept areas between the bomber stream and Berlin. When German night fighters activate their airborne radar to locate the bombers, their emissions appear on our Serrate display. We then become the hunters, tracking them as they attempt to track our bombers. The psychological effect on German crews is profound. They now operate in constant awareness that their own radar transmissions make them targets. We've observed increasing reluctance among German night fighter crews to activate their radar, significantly reducing their effectiveness. The summer of 1944 saw Mosquito operations reach their peak intensity, with near-nightly raids against Berlin. On June 21st, Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, was already underway in Normandy, drawing significant Luftwaffe resources away from Reich defense. Taking advantage of this redistribution, 32 Mosquitoes from the LNSF conducted a daylight precision raid against the Gestapo Records Office in central Berlin. The timing was deliberately coordinated with a massive 8th Air Force raid against synthetic oil plants near Leipzig, forcing German controllers to divide their fighter resources between two widely separated targets. The raid was led by Wing Commander Reginald Reynolds, a veteran of over 50 Mosquito operations. In his pre-mission briefing, he emphasized the broader strategic context. Today, we exploit the stretched state of Luftwaffe defenses. While American heavies draw fighter resources to Leipzig, we will strike Berlin with minimal opposition. Every document we destroy in the Gestapo records office potentially saves lives in the resistance movements across occupied Europe. This is precision bombing with direct human impact, perhaps the most meaningful mission we've undertaken. The result was a devastating demonstration of the Mosquito's capabilities when unopposed. 29 of the 32 aircraft reached the target area, delivering their bombs with remarkable precision. Post-raid reconnaissance photographs showed multiple direct hits on the 7-story building, which collapsed entirely. The records destroyed contained information on resistance networks across occupied Europe, intelligence that might have led to thousands of arrests had it remained intact. The human dimension of these operations extended beyond the crews themselves to the broader communities supporting them. Ground crews working on Mosquitoes developed specialized skills in wooden aircraft maintenance. Many had been furniture makers, cabinet builders, or carpenters in civilian life. They took particular pride in maintaining aircraft that defied conventional military wisdom. Unlike metal aircraft that showed damage clearly, wooden structures required careful inspection for subtle signs of stress or fatigue. These maintenance crews developed almost tactile relationships with their aircraft, able to detect potential issues through touch and sound as much as visual inspection. Chief Technical Officer William Harkins of 105 Squadron described the unique maintenance challenges in a July 1944 technical report. Maintaining wooden aircraft in combat conditions requires skills more akin to cabinet making than conventional aircraft maintenance. Our crews have learned to read the wood, to detect changes in resonance when tapping the structure that indicate hidden stress or delamination. After rain operations, we check carefully for moisture absorption. The irony is that battle damage is often easier to repair in the Mosquito than in metal aircraft. A cannon shell through an aluminum spar requires complex replacement. The same damage to a wooden spar can often be repaired with a carefully fitted wooden patch and specialized adhesives. Aircraft that would be write-offs if built of metal often return to operations within days. The supply chain supporting Mosquito operations represented another revolutionary aspect of the program. Rather than relying on traditional aircraft manufacturing facilities, which were prime targets for German bombing, Mosquito production was distributed across dozens of smaller facilities, many of which had previously produced furniture. Cabinet makers in High Wycombe, piano manufacturers in London, and furniture workshops across Britain contributed components that were then assembled at central facilities. This distributed production model, another innovation born of necessity, proved remarkably resilient to bombing and supply disruption. By autumn 1944, the cumulative impact of Mosquito operations against Berlin had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the war for many Germans. What had begun as an object of ridicule had become a symbol of technological innovation and strategic imagination, qualities that contradicted Nazi propaganda portraying the British as unimaginative and tradition-bound. The wooden aircraft represented an ingenuity and adaptability that increasingly contrasted with the rigid German approach to warfare. A captured German intelligence assessment from September 1944 revealed this shifting perception. The Mosquito represents not merely a technical achievement, but a different approach to problem solving. While our aviation industry focused on incrementally improving established designs, the British fundamentally reconsidered the problem from first principles. The result is an aircraft that cannot be effectively countered within our current defensive framework. More concerning is what this suggests about relative innovation capabilities as the war progresses. If our opponents can reimagine aircraft design so successfully, in what other areas might similar thinking create advantages we cannot readily counter? The later months of 1944 saw Mosquito operations against Berlin take on an additional dimension as the aircraft began serving as pathfinders for larger bomber formations. Mosquitoes equipped with oboe precision navigation systems would mark targets with colored marker bombs, allowing following heavy bombers to concentrate their payloads with greater accuracy than previously possible. This role, while less glamorous than solo precision raids, significantly enhanced the effectiveness of the broader bombing campaign against German industry and infrastructure. The oboe system represented another technical innovation that complemented the Mosquito's capabilities. The system used radio transmitters in England to guide aircraft along a precise path, allowing them to identify targets with unprecedented accuracy even through complete cloud cover. The Mosquito's high operating altitude made it particularly suitable for oboe operations, as the system required line of sight to the ground stations in England. Flight Lieutenant David Baum, an oboe Mosquito navigator, described the experience. Flying on oboe is like being on rails in the sky. You follow the signals with absolute precision, making minute corrections as directed by the tones in your headphones. When the system indicates you're over the target, you release markers with complete confidence, knowing they'll land within yards of the aiming point, even though you might be above solid cloud at 30,000 feet. It transforms bombing from an approximate art to an exact science. The winter of 1944-45 brought increasing hardship to Berlin's population as Allied bombing, both precision Mosquito strikes and massive area raids by heavy bombers, systematically destroyed infrastructure, housing, and industry. Through these increasingly desperate months, the Mosquito remained a constant presence in Berlin's skies and in the psychological landscape of its defenders and civilians alike. The distinctive high-pitched whine of the Mosquito's Merlin engines became known as the sound that freezes the blood, a warning that often came too late for effective defensive measures. Berlin's civil defense chief Ludwig Seehofer wrote in his December 1944 report to the city administration, "The population has developed distinct responses to different air threats. The heavy bomber alarm triggers immediate movement to shelters, but with a certain resigned routine. The Mosquito alarm, often recognizable only by the distinctive engine sound, creates a different, more immediate panic. People have learned that by the time you hear a Mosquito, it is already overhead and releasing its bombs." The psychological toll of this constant, unpredictable threat cannot be overstated. Sleep deprivation is endemic, affecting industrial productivity and civil administration efficiency. In the final months of the European War, as the Eastern and Western fronts closed in on Berlin, Mosquito operations shifted focus toward disrupting German efforts to relocate resources and personnel. Intelligence indicated that Nazi officials were attempting to evacuate scientific equipment, technical documentation, and key personnel from Berlin to Alpine redoubts in southern Germany and Austria. Mosquito precision strikes targeted transportation hubs, particularly the Anhalt and Schlesischer railway stations, through which much of this movement occurred. A particularly effective operation occurred on January 22, 1945, when Mosquitoes of 139 Squadron struck the Schlesischer Bahnhof railway station, just as a train carrying documentation and equipment from the Reich Research Council was preparing to depart for southern Germany. The precision of the attack, with multiple direct hits on the train itself, destroyed irreplaceable scientific documents and prototype equipment that the Nazi regime had hoped to preserve for post-war exploitation. A captured German scientist later told Allied intelligence officers that single raids set back certain research programs by years. Documents representing decades of work were destroyed in minutes. A particularly notable operation took place on February 3, 1945, when Mosquitoes of 105 and 139 squadrons struck the Reich Chancellery during a meeting of Nazi military planners coordinating the defense of Berlin against the advancing Soviet forces. The precision of the attack, 3 direct hits on the specific wing of the building where the meeting was taking place, demonstrated the evolution of intelligence-led targeting. 8 high-ranking officers were killed, and the defensive plans were significantly delayed, contributing to the disorganized German response to the Soviet advance. The Reich Chancellery raid had been guided by intelligence from sources within the German High Command itself, a testament to the collapsing morale among some elements of the Nazi leadership. The intelligence not only specified the meeting time and location, but provided detailed information about which entrance the officers would use and the specific room where they would gather. Wing Commander Michael Stevens, who led the raid, noted in his after-action report, "We received the intelligence update just 2 hours before takeoff, barely enough time to adjust our planning. The precision of the information was remarkable, allowing us to time our arrival for maximum effect and select the exact aiming point for our bombs." This level of specific, actionable intelligence represents a new phase in precision targeting. As the war in Europe approached its conclusion, Mosquito operations against Berlin continued literally until the final days of the conflict. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's birthday, 6 Mosquitoes conducted a final symbolic raid on the Reich Chancellery, even as Soviet artillery was already shelling Berlin's eastern suburbs. The raid, while militarily insignificant given the collapsing German state, provided powerful symbolic closure to a campaign that had begun with German mockery and concluded with the near-total destruction of the Nazi regime. Flight Lieutenant Peter Jackson, who participated in this final raid, described the surreal experience in his diary. "As we approached Berlin, we could actually see Soviet artillery flashes to the east of the city. The anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and inaccurate, nothing like the formidable defenses we faced a year ago. Most of the city was obscured by smoke from countless fires. We delivered our bombs on the Chancellery complex, though determining damage assessment was difficult through the haze. There was something profoundly symbolic about delivering this final blow on Hitler's birthday, a day that had once seen massive celebrations in the very buildings we were now reducing to rubble. The regime that had once mocked our wooden planes was now being systematically destroyed by them. When Berlin finally fell to Soviet forces on May 2, 1945, the impact of the Mosquito campaign could be assessed in both physical and psychological terms. While heavy bombers had delivered far greater tonnage of explosives, the precision, persistence, and psychological impact of Mosquito operations had played a crucial role in undermining German morale and disrupting Nazi command functions. The wooden aircraft that had been dismissed as primitive had demonstrated that innovation often comes from unexpected directions. In the post-war analysis of air operations against Germany, the Mosquito emerged as one of the most successful combat aircraft of the conflict. Its loss rate per sortie was the lowest of any aircraft in RAF Bomber Command, a testament to the vision of Jeffrey de Havilland and the crews who flew his creation. The aircraft's versatility had seen it perform successfully as a bomber, fighter, night fighter, reconnaissance platform, and pathfinder, roles that would typically require multiple specialized aircraft types. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, summarized the Mosquito's contribution in his post-war assessment. The Mosquito was one of the wonders of the war. Without armor, without self-sealing tanks, without defensive armament, it could outpace and outmaneuver any fighter the enemy could put against it. It carried the same bomb load to Berlin as a B-17, but with a crew of 2 instead of 10, and with a casualty rate that was a fraction of the heavy bombers. If I had been given the resources to build more Mosquitoes instead of Lancasters, we could have accomplished our mission with significantly lower crew casualties. Beyond its military significance, the Mosquito represented something more profound, the triumph of lateral thinking over brute force, approaches to technological challenges. In an era dominated by the pursuit of bigger, heavier, and more heavily armed aircraft, the Mosquito demonstrated that speed, precision, and adaptability could prove more valuable than raw destructive power. This lesson would influence military aviation development for decades to follow, particularly in the fields of strike aircraft and precision weapons delivery. Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who had championed the Mosquito project within the Air Ministry despite initial skepticism, reflected on this aspect in a 1946 lecture at the Royal Aeronautical Society. The Mosquito represented a fundamental rethinking of combat aircraft design principles. Rather than attempting to survive enemy fire through armor and defensive armament, the conventional approach, it was designed to avoid being hit altogether through speed and agility. This seemingly simple shift in perspective produced an aircraft that could operate with greater effectiveness and dramatically lower losses than its conventional counterparts. The lesson extends beyond aviation. Sometimes the most effective solution comes not from refining existing approaches, but from reconsidering the problem entirely. For the German pilots who had initially laughed at the wooden bomber, the Mosquito provided a humbling lesson in the dangers of technological arrogance. Their dismissal of wood as an inferior material reflected a broader inflexibility in German military thinking, an over-reliance on conventional wisdom and established doctrine that ultimately contributed to their defeat. The Mosquito's success against the vaunted Luftwaffe demonstrated that innovation often requires questioning fundamental assumptions rather than simply refining existing approaches. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces and later General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe, offered perhaps the most candid post-war assessment from the German perspective. The Mosquito was the most elegant aircraft of the war. We had nothing to match it. Our mistake was in believing that combat aircraft development could only proceed along established lines: metal construction, increasingly heavy armament, and armor protection. The British took a different path that we dismissed as technically backward. We were wrong. Their wooden construction techniques, far from being primitive, were actually more advanced than our metal fabrication in many respects. The Mosquito made us look like technological conservatives rather than innovators, a painful realization for German engineering pride. The human stories behind the Mosquito campaign over Berlin illuminate aspects of the air war often overlooked in broader strategic narratives. Unlike the massive bomber formations where individual aircraft became almost anonymous within the larger stream, Mosquito operations maintained a distinctly personal character. Crews often flew the same aircraft repeatedly, developing the kind of familiarity and trust that contributed to operational success. Their missions required not just courage but exceptional skill, precise navigation, split-second timing, and perfect coordination between pilot and navigator. Squadron leader Jeffrey Williams, who completed 35 operations over Berlin, described this intimate operational dynamic in a 1945 interview. "In a Mosquito, you're not just crew, you're partners. My navigator Tom and I developed a shorthand communication that seemed almost telepathic after our 10th mission together. He could anticipate my questions. I could sense when he needed a particular flight correction for his calculations. This wasn't just camaraderie, it was operational efficiency that kept us alive. The heavy bomber boys were incredibly brave, but they operated as components in a massive machine. We operated more like a precision instrument, where the slightest misalignment between us could be fatal." The distinctive wooden construction of the Mosquito created unique maintenance challenges and relationships between ground crews and aircraft. Chief Mechanic Albert Townsend of 139 Squadron described the difference. "Metal aircraft tell you when they're damaged. You see the dents, tears, and holes. Wood is more subtle. After missions, we'd run our hands along the surfaces, feeling for inconsistencies in the smooth birch ply. We'd tap the structure, listening for changes in resonance that might indicate internal damage. It became almost intuitive, like a physician diagnosing a patient rather than a mechanic fixing a machine. Many of us came from furniture and cabinet-making backgrounds, so working with wood felt natural. We took enormous pride in maintaining aircraft that the Germans had initially ridiculed but now feared more than any other. The operational successes of the Mosquito over Berlin attracted attention at the highest levels of Allied leadership. In March 1945, Winston Churchill visited 105 Squadron to personally congratulate the crews. After inspecting a Mosquito that had completed over 50 operations, Churchill reportedly ran his hand along the wooden fuselage and remarked, "This aircraft represents the perfect marriage of traditional British craftsmanship with modern innovation. The Germans mocked it as outdated, yet it has consistently outperformed their most advanced metal fighters." There's a profound lesson here about the dangers of technological arrogance that extends far beyond this war. In the decades following the war, the Mosquito's legacy would continue to influence military aviation development. The concept of a high-speed, minimal armament strike aircraft would find expression in designs ranging from the Canberra jet bomber to modern stealth aircraft. The emphasis on speed and agility over armor and defensive armament became a central tenet of post-war combat aircraft design. Perhaps most significantly, the precision targeting pioneered by Mosquito operations would evolve into the concept of surgical strikes that dominates modern air warfare doctrine. Kelly Johnson, the legendary Lockheed aircraft designer responsible for the U-2 and SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft, acknowledged the Mosquito's influence in his memoir. "The Mosquito demonstrated a fundamental principle that guided my design philosophy: speed is the best defense." De Havilland's team created an aircraft that survived through performance rather than protection, a concept we applied to our high-altitude reconnaissance designs. They also showed that unconventional materials, properly employed, could create performance advantages that conventional approaches couldn't match. The Mosquito was decades ahead of its time in concept, if not in technology. For the Berliners who endured the Mosquito campaign, the experience left complex legacies. Many post-war accounts from Berlin civilians specifically mentioned the psychological impact of Mosquito raids, the helplessness they felt, knowing that no warning would come, no air raid siren would sound in time, no shelter could be reached before bombs fell. Unlike the massive formations of heavy bombers that could be tracked approaching from miles away, the Mosquito struck without warning, creating a persistent anxiety that many described as more debilitating than the fear of conventional raids. Greta Miller, a Berlin school teacher who kept a detailed diary throughout the war, wrote in February 1945, "The heavy bombers are terrifying but predictable. The sirens sound, we go to the shelters, we endure the trembling earth for hours, then emerge to see what remains. The Mosquitoes are different. They come without warning, strike precisely, and vanish. Last week they hit the Railway Administration building across from our school exactly at noon. We had no warning, just the sound of engines, then explosions, then silence again. This constant uncertainty is perhaps more damaging to morale than the massive destruction of the night raids. We never know when or where they will strike next, only that they can reach us anywhere, anytime." The air crews who flew these remarkable missions against Berlin represented a special category within RAF Bomber Command. Unlike heavy bomber crews who operated in the relative anonymity of large formations, Mosquito crews developed reputations as individualists, airmen who combined exceptional flying skills with an almost artistic approach to their craft. Their operations required not just technical proficiency, but imagination, adaptability, and psychological resilience. Many would go on to distinguished careers in post-war aviation, bringing the lessons learned over Berlin to the development of civilian and military aircraft. Wing Commander John Wooldridge, who led many of the early Mosquito operations against Berlin, transitioned to a notable post-war career as a composer and conductor, frequently citing the influence of his Mosquito experience on his musical sensibilities. Flying the Mosquito was more art than science, a constant balance between precision and improvisation, much like orchestral conducting. The rhythm of the Merlin engines, the tension and release of combat operations, the harmony required between pilot and navigator, all these found expression in my musical compositions after the war. The Mosquito taught me that technical perfection alone is insufficient. True excellence requires an element of creative interpretation within a disciplined framework. The ground crews who maintained these wooden wonders represented another crucial element in the Mosquito story. Their specialized skills, many drawn from woodworking trades rather than traditional aircraft maintenance, enabled the operational success of the aircraft. They developed techniques for detecting and repairing damage to wooden structures that would later influence civilian aircraft maintenance. Their ability to keep Mosquitoes flying despite the challenges of weather, combat damage, and material shortages contributed significantly to the campaign's success. William Morris, a former furniture maker who served as a Mosquito maintenance crew chief, described the unique challenges in a 1946 technical paper. Maintaining wooden aircraft in combat conditions required us to develop entirely new approaches to damage assessment and repair. We created specialized tools for detecting delamination between wood layers, techniques for splicing structural components, and new formulations of adhesives that could cure properly in field conditions. Most significantly, we learned to think of the aircraft structure as an integrated whole rather than as replaceable components. These approaches later influenced civil aviation maintenance, particularly in the composite structures that became common decades later. For Geoffrey de Havilland, the architect of this revolutionary aircraft, the Berlin campaign vindicated his unconventional approach to combat aircraft design. His insistence on wooden construction, initially born of necessity, had created capabilities that metal aircraft of the era simply could not match. The success of his creation against the capital of the Third Reich demonstrated that innovation often requires challenging established wisdom rather than refining it. His vision would influence aircraft design long after materials technology had rendered wood obsolete as a primary construction material. In a rare post-war interview, de Havilland reflected on the Mosquito's legacy. The lesson of the Mosquito is not about wood versus metal. That's a superficial reading. The true lesson is about questioning fundamental assumptions. The conventional wisdom held that bombers needed defensive armament and armor to survive. We asked whether an aircraft could be made fast enough to avoid interception altogether, eliminating the weight penalties of guns and armor. That conceptual shift, not the material choice, was the true innovation. Future aircraft designers would do well to remember that breakthrough performance often comes not from incremental improvements, but from reconsidering basic assumptions. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Mosquito campaign over Berlin lies in its demonstration that asymmetric approaches can overcome seemingly insurmountable advantages. The Luftwaffe, with its sophisticated radar network, hundreds of fighters, and thousands of anti-aircraft guns, should theoretically have been able to prevent a wooden aircraft from repeatedly penetrating to the heart of the Reich. Their failure to do so stemmed not from lack of resources or determination, but from fundamental misconceptions about the nature of the threat they faced. This lesson, that innovation can render defensive systems obsolete not through superior force but through reimagining the problem, remains relevant in military thinking today. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who had commanded RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, articulated this principle in a 1946 lecture at the Royal United Services Institute. The Mosquito's success against Berlin demonstrated a principle that extends far beyond aviation. When faced with a seemingly impenetrable defense, the solution may not be greater force, but a fundamentally different approach. The Germans expected bombers to attack in certain ways and built defenses to counter those expected methods. The Mosquito operated outside their defensive paradigm. This lesson applies to all military planning, The most dangerous threat is often not the one you prepared to meet, but the one that exploits gaps in your conceptual framework. The story of the Mosquito over Berlin ultimately transcends its military significance to illuminate broader principles of human innovation and adaptation. What began as a material workaround, building aircraft from wood when metal was scarce, evolved into a revolutionary approach to aerial warfare that combined precision, psychological impact, and minimal force. The wooden aircraft that German pilots had initially mocked became the instrument of their humiliation, demonstrating that true innovation often comes not from incremental improvements to existing systems, but from fundamental reconsiderations of first principles. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, the legacy of the Mosquito was already secure. The wooden wonder had proven that sometimes the most effective response to a seemingly overwhelming challenge is not to match force with greater force, but to reimagine the problem entirely. For the German pilots who had once laughed at the wooden Mosquito, this lesson came too late. For military planners and innovators who followed, it would provide inspiration for decades to come. The Mosquito's story contained another powerful lesson about the danger of technological prejudice, the tendency to equate familiar approaches with superiority and to dismiss unfamiliar ones as primitive. The German leadership's mockery of wooden aircraft reflected a broader cultural assumption that newer materials and more complex systems were inherently superior to traditional ones. This technological hubris prevented them from recognizing the Mosquito's revolutionary potential until it was demonstrating that potential over Berlin with devastating effectiveness. Aviation historian Richard Overy noted this aspect in his analysis. The initial German dismissal of the Mosquito as a wooden wonder revealed a form of technological chauvinism that has repeatedly undermined military effectiveness throughout history. The assumption that advanced technology must follow predictable evolutionary paths, in this case from wood to metal construction, created a blind spot that the British effectively exploited. The Germans were looking for advances along the vectors they understood and expected, while the truly disruptive innovation came from an entirely different direction. The final tally of Mosquito operations against Berlin reveals their remarkable effectiveness. Between January 1943 and April 1945, Mosquitoes conducted over 200 precision raids against the German capital, delivering approximately 1,000 tons of bombs on specific high-value targets. While this tonnage represented a fraction of what heavy bombers delivered, the precision with which it was applied created disproportionate effects. More significantly, these operations were conducted with the loss of only 38 aircraft, a loss rate of less than 2% compared to the 5 to 7% typically experienced by heavy bomber formations. This exceptional survivability meant that Mosquito crews accumulated experience at rates impossible for heavy bomber crews, while Lancaster crews rarely completed their tour of 30 operations before being shot down, wounded, or killed. Many Mosquito crews completed 50 or more missions. This experience translated directly into increased effectiveness. Crews became intimately familiar with approach routes, defensive patterns, and target identification. The most experienced crews could navigate to Berlin and identify specific buildings under conditions that would have rendered less experienced crews ineffective. As Allied forces sifted through captured German records in the aftermath of victory, they discovered further evidence of the Mosquito's psychological impact. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from January 1945 had concluded the Mosquito phenomenon represents not merely a tactical challenge, but a strategic psychological weapon. The aircraft's ability to strike without warning at any location in Berlin has created a perpetual state of anxiety among both civilian and military leadership. The population has come to fear the distinctive sound of Mosquito engines more than the air raid sirens that precede conventional bombing. This persistent psychological pressure compounds the physical damage, creating effects disproportionate to the tonnage of bombs delivered. In the post-war reorganization of global air power, the lessons of the Mosquito would be studied and applied by air forces worldwide. The USAF Strategic Air Command incorporated the concept of high-speed, minimal armament penetration into its planning. The Soviet Air Force developed analogous concepts for precision targeting of command and control facilities. The basic principle that speed and precision could be more effective than mass and firepower would find expression in everything from tactical strike aircraft to intercontinental ballistic missiles. For the city of Berlin itself, the Mosquito campaign left physical and psychological scars that would remain long after reconstruction erased the visible damage. In the collective memory of Berliners who lived through the war years, the Mosquito occupied a unique position, respected and feared in equal measure for its precision and inevitability. Unlike the massive bomber streams that leveled entire districts, the Mosquito struck with surgical precision, often leaving adjacent buildings untouched while destroying specific targets. This precision created a different kind of psychological impact, the knowledge that the wooden bomber could find and strike any specific location in the city with apparent impunity. As the Cold War divided Berlin into East and West, the memory of the Mosquito campaigns faded, but never disappeared entirely. Veterans on both sides occasionally met at aviation history events, former adversaries united by their shared respect for an aircraft that had changed the nature of aerial warfare. Luftwaffe pilots who had once pursued the wooden wonder over Berlin would stand alongside RAF crews who had flown it, examining preserved examples with the appreciation that comes from direct experience. The story of the Mosquito over Berlin ultimately represents more than a military campaign. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity and the power of unconventional thinking in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The wooden aircraft that German pilots had initially dismissed as primitive became one of the most effective weapons of the air war, demonstrating that innovation often comes from unexpected directions and that questioning fundamental assumptions can lead to breakthrough performance. In the final analysis, perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the Mosquito campaign against Berlin came from Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, commander of the Pathfinder Force, who wrote in his post-war memoir, "The Mosquito proved that precision could be more effective than mass, that speed could overcome defenses that firepower could not penetrate, and that wood, the most ancient of aircraft materials, could outperform the most advanced metal designs when employed with imagination and daring." The wooden wonder that the Germans mocked became the aircraft they feared above all others, a fitting lesson in the dangers of technological arrogance that resonates far beyond the specific context of World War II aviation.